In this discussion, we will discover some of the key issues in the creation of sauces. We'll see that no matter what kind of sauce we're talking about, its quality boils down to, if we put aside flavor for the moment, its texture. How viscous is it? Is it too liquid or runny to cling to whatever it's poured over? Is it so thick that it's hard to concentrate on anything else? Is it heavy with fats or gluey with starch? Light but too liquid? Or is it perfectly viscous, creating a nice coating on the food it's served with a velvety texture that augments the flavors it delivers? Is it creamy, buttery, savory, sweet? The flavors are obviously important too, but we'll spend less time on these during this lecture and more on the chemistry and physics of what gives sauces their texture. So it's all about obstructing the flow of the continuous phase. What's a continuous phase? Well, most of the time it's water or some meat or vegetable broth that's based on water. The more stuff that crowds the solution or suspension, the more viscous the flow of the liquid. Considered this way, then, sauce preparation can be thought of as a triangle with three variables making up the corners. First, dispersion of large pieces of vegetable material, like pureed tomatoes. Here I've used bolognese sauce as a kind of poor example. Most of us think of bolognese sauce as a classic tomato-based Italian sauce, but the citizens of Bologna might scoff at this and instead give us a plate of meat, probably beef, but it could be veal or some kind of pork. So a meat-based sauce, with the tomato being a relatively, though not unwelcome, addition. Next, though, we return to two recurring characters in the story of the kitchen, namely starch and protein. Both of these adopt their own particular structures at elevated temperatures, both amounting to long, flexible chains that wander through the solution, interacting with each other and other molecules in loose networks that also serve to obstruct the flow of the continuous phase. With starch, we'll see that this is the result of dissolving starch grains into long, dynamic chains of amylose and amylopectin, and you'll remember these guys from their importance in bread and beer. With proteins, though, we revisit the idea of denaturation, or unfolding of the native, natural shape. The long chains that result form structures that are very like the structures we saw in egg foams and bread gluten networks. Either way, though, we're talking about a gossamer network of biological molecules slowing down the flow of the sauce liquid, making it more sauce-like, more viscous. My examples here are for meat and protein-based thickeners, gelatins. And yes, the familiar Jell-O is a meat byproduct. And for vegetable or carbohydrate-based thickeners, jellies. The pectin added to jams and jellies are there to augment whatever natural sugar polymers of its own the fruit possesses. These are both extreme cases, gelatins and jellies. Essentially, they're gels that have almost a solid appearance, but the same polymers can be used to merely thicken a liquid into a sauce. Finally, emulsions. You will recall that when making egg foams, it was of utmost importance to avoid inclusion of any of the yolk's emulsifying lecithins in the whites. Well, in some sauces, the emulsifier is critical to the whole enterprise too. In the case of an emulsion, two liquids that don't mix are more or less tricked or forced into cohabitating. But since they don't actually mix, the continuous phase, it could be either oil or water, is less continuous, takes up less continuous space, and is thus effectively slowed down, made more viscous, made into a sauce. Our great examples here are mayonnaise, which is indeed just oil and vinegar, and yes, egg yolk, and vinaigrette dressing, which is really just oil and vinegar and some emulsifier. These are two really fun examples as they are both emulsions, but in mayonnaise, the continuous phase is water, with oil droplets beat in until they form some 80% of the total volume. Vinaigrette dressing, on the other hand, usually makes oil the continuous phase into which water droplets are beaten. More on that later. Let me say now, though, that I'm not counting foams as one of the saucing methods. Perhaps since one might argue that making foam is actually a kind of emulsion. But let's just hasten to point out that these extrema, dispersion of particles, tendrils of biomolecules, starch or protein, and emulsions may be used in combination to achieve a wide variety of results. Consider that most sauces do contain ground vegetable or meat particles, and they contain starch molecules and denatured proteins that tangle things up. Now, it's traditional to include a discussion of French sauces in this kind of discussion, and we will too, but first let me elide over much Western sauce history by saying that people everywhere have always mashed up vegetables with water and poured this over something, be it some starchy vegetable or grain or tuber, or over meat. McGee discusses changes in food culture in terms of the French Revolution, before which time high cuisine was focused in the homes of the aristocracy. After the Revolution, out-of-work chefs went on to open their own restaurants and serve something like they did before to the masses, cheaper. Now it's kind of telling that the king of chefs, Marie-Antoine Carême, actually worked for Napoleon, other nobles, as well as wealthy merchants. High cuisine was still something focused on the upper classes. The story goes that to get hired by Napoleon, he had to write a menu that would serve a different meal each day for a year using only seasonal vegetables. Supposedly he did this and was hired. But what he's really known for, though, is his exhaustive written works on French cooking, in which he enumerated literally hundreds of sauces. His countryman, Auguste Escoffier, used similar categorization schemes, but he simplified and popularized French recipes. From these two chefs, we have 5 mother sauces, listed here, along with some others. These consist of the roux, or starch-based sauces, which I'm showing Espagnole, velouté, Allemande, bechamel, emulsions, hollandaise, mayonnaise, and vegetable-based sauces, tomato sauce in particular. The roux are characterized essentially by their color. Now, roux is just a mixture of fat and starch, whisked into a homogeneous mixture with no clumps and no clods, that is then cooked. This helps open up the starch, as we'll see, but it also browns the roux. In white roux, the flour is only minimally cooked and no browning reactions have taken place. In yellow roux, the flour is partially cooked, and in a brown roux, the color is really highly developed by heating the flour extensively. The sauces themselves also depend on their liquid base. Brown, using stock from red meat, yellow from white meat, and Allemande uses eggs. Note here the mixture of proteins, that is, eggs and starch as thickeners. Interestingly, 3 of these, Espagnole, Allemande, and Hollandaise, are named for the nations from which they originally rose, Spain, Germany, and the Netherlands, respectively. Bechamel, starch suspended in milk, is a common component of lasagnas. In fact, my wife uses it all the time and replaces all the mozzarella used in more common recipes, important for her as she's lactose intolerant. And indeed, McGee discusses a sprinkle of flour into any number of vegetable oil and meat sautés as a means of thickening it into a sauce. I'm not going to go into the gravies so common to British food and so important to my own life, but let's remember that they too are a kind of variation on the roux. Really, though, let's take away from this that we can use starch as a thickener in any number of situations and in combination with proteins derived from meat or other source. It's also really fun to point out that Escoffier's method is perhaps more scientific as a means of classification. It captures the 3 corners of the triangle we built on the last slide. And while we might never encounter all these specific French sauces, we might try to place any sauce we do encounter in the context of these types of constructs. Okay, here's a few images of the 4 of these sauces, pirated shamelessly from the web. You get the sense of how diversely they may be employed, though all based on a simple amalgam of flour and fat. Here's brown roux with a red meat stock. Here's Allemande, a yellow roux made with eggs and chicken. In this case, this is a seafood dish. Here's velouté, the yellow roux made in lasagna. And here's a bechamel. Oh, these are mixed up. Here's the velouté served over the yellow roux served over broccoli, and here's the bechamel I was talking about as a lasagna. Okay, now, this is a complex slide, and there's no possible way that it can do justice to the diversity of sauces in cultures from around the world, but these are definitely sauces you should know about. So let's take a minute to look at these, and then I'll run through them. Let's start in Europe and work outwards from there with the ragout. This particular ragout is again the bolognese with finely chopped meat, served over some tagliatelle. Delicious. Next, though, tzatziki, in its Greek formulation, found in various forms around the Eastern Mediterranean as a yogurt-based sauce. We're already familiar with where the thickening that takes place in yogurt comes from. But let's skip over to China, and again, There's no possible way I could describe China's so-called 8 culinary traditions, but these are not really sauce-based anyway, or not really sauce-based classifications anyway, so we can focus on just a couple of key players. First, Sichuan, the province that gives us Sichuan style. My favorite pictured here is Kung Pao chicken. Now, I like this picture because it doesn't show any big chili peppers in the sauce, because Sichuan cooking is best known for Sichuan peppercorns, not chili peppers. These peppercorns have a numbing burn that is unique to them, and more on that in a minute. Next comes Fujian style, named after the southeastern province. Of course, as a coastal province, seafood is important to Fujian style, but it's also noted for its drunken style, making use of the rice wine known as Hongju. Now, this particular soup is called Buddha Jumps Over the Wall. It contains shark fin and is thus now recipe non grata. Let's move into South Asia and Southeast Asia. I've painted a really broad brush for curries, as you can see. The dark circle, though, here is to note that it's possible that something like curry originated a few thousand years ago in what is now Pakistan. I'm not going to try to distinguish all of the varieties of curry. They are myriad. And the spice variations are as diverse as the geography indicated here. Interestingly though, like the Sichuan dish, many curries incorporate chili peppers. That's a New World plant. But we'll talk in another lecture on globalization of spices. Incidentally, a favorite Western Indian dish, chicken tikka masala, is often ridiculed because it was actually invented in England as a way of making dry chicken tikka more appetizing by making a tomatoey sauce out of it. The point that I guess I'm trying to make here is just very few of these regional recipes can really stand up to the native test and incorporate ingredients from around the globe. Really, that's been the history of food and spices for much of human history. Anyway, back to curry. This slide is simply showing you a couple of different curry possibilities. Generally speaking, the spices themselves can serve as a sort of thickener. But moving on, I want to present a couple of other items from the Indian subcontinent. And again, there's no way to do this justice in a single slide, but it would be a crime to omit these two items. Garam masala, a spice blend actually, used in a variety of different sauces and dishes, mostly from northern India, many of them actually classifying as curries, and again including the non-Indian chili pepper. Other important spices: peppercorns, cloves, nutmegs, cumin, and coriander. Again, we'll revisit those in their own lecture later. Vindaloo is another diverse style of curry. Like other, quote, curries, more generally has become synonymous to Western ears with Indian cuisine, though the dish we might think of bears little resemblance to the Indian dish vindaloo. For Westerners, curry might be used to indicate any sauce that emphasizes coriander, cumin, turmeric, and, again, chili peppers. Let's move to Africa. It's worth mentioning a couple of dishes from Africa. Wat is actually a class of dishes from Ethiopia and Eritrea, often referred to as curries as well, confusingly enough, but are spiced with a mixture called berber, which uses, among many others, the spice fenugreek. Wats are generally stews served over a variety of meats, and let me remind you that they are eaten using injera, the traditional Ethiopian flatbread we heard about in a previous lecture on breads. But moving on to West Africa, mafe. Mafe is a common sauce, and like so many they are served over starchy vegetables. Mafe is usually based on ground nuts, often peanuts, and these, along with tomatoes, New World vegetable, serve as the source of thickeners. Last, let's go to the New World, where again we're alighting over so much food diversity to bring you only a few highlights that emphasize the different aspects of sauces. First, Western Mexico, birria, a goat stew, this time based on chilies that are native to the region. The roasted chili peppers serve as the source of thickeners, mostly starches. Next, mole. Wow, I could go on and on about mole, but suffice it to say that the state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico is a fountain of sauce wonder. Mole is Nahuatl or Aztec word for sauce, and the base is often chilies, but can also be almonds or squash seeds, so-called pipián sauce. Pipián is one of my favorites. Of course, the well-known mole poblano is an incredibly complex sauce, and its most famous component is chocolate. another New World native. Finally, I want to introduce you to puca picante, a Peruvian dish made with pureed beets and peanuts. There's a combination of vegetable particles and starch thickeners used here, served like much of Peruvian food over potatoes or rice. Again, note the rice from Asia and the peanuts from Africa in this recipe. Overall, though we see that though we have a diversity of local details, the fundamentals are more or less common to all these sauces. Okay, now here's a bit of a biochemical aside. As I mentioned, peppercorns and chili peppers on the last slide. Here are 3 molecular structures, and with these I want to emphasize the structural similarities and flavor differences of some of the important hot spices. First, the sanshoals are a family of molecules, and I've drawn here alpha-hydroxysanshoal. These are derived from the black Sichuan peppercorn. Let's note, too, that sanshoal is actually derived from the word sanshoal is actually derived from the Japanese name sansho for this Chinese peppercorn. Again, the sanshoals are known for their particular numbing burn. Incidentally, since we have mentioned Japan, here's the structure of the hot ingredient of wasabi, a Japanese horseradish. Allyl isothiocyanate is the important piquant, that is to say, spicy hot ingredient of other horseradishes and mustards too. But back to the sanshoals. Though the Sichuan pepper is to be distinguished botanically and chemically from the black pepper, which has a less intense burn, and is one of the main active ingredients in black and white peppercorns, is piperine. Here we go. I want to emphasize, though, that they have some structural similarities that the organic chemists in the audience will notice right away. I won't make too much of these except to say that the structural similarities are largely responsible for their similar flavors. We could extend this biochemically to remind ourselves that the molecular function follows from the molecular structure. Similar structural details are present in capsaicin, the hot molecule of the New World spiced chili pepper. Now, there are diverse chili pepper varieties, but it is thought that all of these derive from a couple of different species native to the Americas. Capsaicin has found uses outside the kitchen too, particularly pepper spray, so useful as a crowd control device and bear repellent. We'll talk more about chili peppers in other lectures, but let's stick with the molecular structure similarities for a minute to think about how all these hot molecules work. All 4 types of molecules activate a neuronal receptor protein class called the TRP channels. These are found in pain-sensing neurons on the tongue and elsewhere, and when activated by the hot molecules, open up to allow ions to flow across membranes. That so-called depolarization of the nerve cell is the pain stimulus that's transmitted to the brain. Here we see a gorgeous picture of the protein structure of the transient receptor potential family of channels, with the hot molecule binding site, whether it's capsaicin or sanshoal or piperine, is highlighted in red. One more detail that's important to note, that heat, spiciness, piquancy, call it what you will, these all affect the quote-unquote flavor of the food, but they don't belong to the 5 classic tastes: salt, sweet, sour, bitter, and umami or savory. Together with minty menthol flavors, capsaicins and other hot molecules help show how taste is really a very complex problem, and many will state that these 5 flavors as though they were simple or somehow inferior to aroma, but don't be fooled. But now I'm really digressing. Let's return to sauces, please. Skipping past the relatively simple concept of big vegetable particles obstructing the flow of liquid and making a more viscous sauce, let's move on to another corner of the triangle for a look at some more molecular details. So, in their native states, proteins are usually fairly compact, self-organized molecules, and starches are wound up tight in starch granules. But when we expose either of these, starch or protein, to extreme heat, they open up to form wild, tangled, dynamic messes. The intermolecular interactions that characterize this condition amount to a long-range network that also obstructs liquid flow, increasing velocity. By the way, increasing viscosity. By the way, viscosity here's the OED definition. Quote, the state of being thick, sticky, and semi-fluid in consistency due to internal friction. So we're seeing that these long, tangly molecules, whether they're starch that's been unwound or proteins that have been unfolded, reach out and obstruct the flow of water, increasing the viscosity.